Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're continuing our study of the New Testament, which is an evolution from our classes that we had at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio. And this is the first of what I think will be two programs on Revelation. Revelation is not my favorite. Everybody knows that. It's very challenging. There are people who love it. I know people who love it. I know people who are mystified by it. And it's been a source of discussion, debate, even trouble, because some people like David Koresh, who had that siege down in Waco, took it and interpreted his own ways into all kinds of evil manifestations of it. So it's been very, very tricky a book. And it I'll spend as much time on the background trying to explain it as anything else. It appears to have been written about 95 AD in the first century by a man named John, who was exiled by the Roman Emperor Domitian, who died in 94 or 95, had the first organized persecution of the Christians. After that, it kind of died away for a while, and it popped up again, and it was sporadic. But his was the first one, and this person named John was exiled to the island of Patmos. The island of Patmos is a Greek island about 40 miles off the southwest coast of Turkey, down near Ephesus. I've not seen it. I've not been to that Greek island, even though I've been to Ephesus, the Pergamum, a couple of places we mentioned here. So he was sent there and apparently lived in a cave. And while he was there in exile, he hated the Roman Empire because they had sent him off to this exile, living in a cave on Patmos. And he had a vision or series of visions that led him to write Revelation. Now, this is not the author of the fourth gospel, or the Gospel of John. That the Greek is very, very different. This Greek is not nearly as polished or accomplished as the Greek of the Gospel of John or the letters of John. Most people think he probably came from the school, which is a term that's used for the followers of one arm of Christian belief at the time, from Ephesus, where the Gospel of John was probably written. In my opinion, it was, but we don't really know that. So he has some of the terminology that you'll find in the Gospel of John and some similarities, but clearly the Greek is very, very different. And therefore, it's not written by the same person. I'll be very clear here. I'm using a source. This is William Barclay's book. He has a 2-volume series on Revelation, and he has, I think, 17-volume commentary on the New Testament. He was a classic scholar of New Testament Greek. He spent his whole life studying New Testament Greek, so he could explain what the various words meant, what the implications of the words were, and make the text come more realistically alive. So I got that quote from him that the Greek was very different. And so I'm using a lot of his resources. He was a professor of divinity and biblical criticism at the University of Glasgow in Glasgow, Scotland. I actually met him. I was 20 years old and then junior year in Scotland, and my mother was a big fan of his, and so I brought a book back of his. I went home at Christmas time. I came back with a book that we had gotten in West Virginia, and the faculty who knew him said, "I'll just go over and knock on his door. He's fine." So I went over the afternoon, knocked on his door. He was extremely gracious to me. I really appreciated it. He didn't need to be, but he was, and just a true Christian gentleman, so I really appreciated it. So I got the book downstairs now. So it's a very positive thing to me to be able to use this. But somebody has to explain this to me because it's too complicated for me to understand. Now this is called, so he probably came from Ephesus and was sent out to Patmos in exile. Sounds like a fiery guy, because he clearly hated the Roman Empire after what they did to him. I don't blame him. They sent me to a cave in Patmos. I'd be really unhappy with him too. And apparently there's a cave there that tourists go to see the cave. Whether it actually is the cave, I don't really know. I've not been there. So he gets sent out there. And what he's writing is what's called apocalyptic writing. Now there's two types of discussion or writing in the New Testament and the Old Testament that deals with the end of time. eschatological writing, and Jesus talked in an eschatological term about the end of our time, that as an individual, our time will end on this earth, and hopefully not for a while, but it could be imminently. And so he talks about it in a way about us moving on to the next world. And he's very nonspecific about what the next world is. It's very interesting because when they pin him down and ask him about the woman who'd had a series of husbands, who would be her husband in the afterlife, all he would say was, it's not like that. He wouldn't tell us what it was like, but he wasn't like that. So he's the only person who knew what heaven was like, wouldn't tell us. So that's a very interesting. That's called eschatology. There's no violence in eschatology. There's not this big struggle. Apocalyptic writing is end of time writing also, but it's a huge battle between the forces of evil and the forces of good. And have this huge battle, and there's lots of dead people, and that's apocalyptic writing. There is a cross between the two of them, but they mean basically different things. So this is apocalyptic writing, and this is not unique in the writings of about God. That what you find is when the Hebrew people were at times of great stress and being abused by foreign powers, some of them would fall back on apocalyptic writing, basically calling down the forces of God on their evil people that were oppressing, which is a good way to describe it. The first one we see is in Ezekiel. If you ever read Ezekiel in the Old Testament, it's a tough one. And they're in the Babylonian exile there, so he's calling down God's forces to relieve them of this evil oppressor, and God's going to win in the end, and everything's going to be fine, and you guys are going to get what you deserve. There's a lot of that in it. You found it also in Daniel, which was written toward the end of the actually after Babylon. Daniel was written when they were being ruled by Greek monarchs who were the descendants of the people who, from Alexander's time, Alexander the Great, he died and he left Greek generals in charge. They became kings of various areas, and they were under oppression by the Greeks. And then there's several of these books in what's called the Intertestament period, from about 250 BC until Jesus' time. There's a variety of these books. That's when the Romans were in charge, and they were oppressing the people. And I've got some of them downstairs. I've not read them. But these are well known. The Pseudepigrapha, they're called. The book of Enoch is very much into this apocalyptic writing. Ezra 4, the Assumption of Moses. There's a whole bunch of them. And like I said, they're written at times when you're feeling abuse and stressed, and what you're you're predicting that God is going to come down and savage your enemies and reward you, and everything's going to be fine. Interesting question. How did this odd book get into the New Testament? Because it's of the only books in the New Testament, it's the only one that's really produced trouble, like the David Koresh story, etc. The rest of them you can argue about how you interpret it. Do you have to be legalistic? Do you have to be non-legalistic, like Paul said? How did this book get in? Now, this is all hypothesis at this point. The three criteria that drove the selection process for the New Testament, which really crescendoed in the 4th century, between 325, the Council of Nicaea, and about 365, when the books appear to be firmed up, were three criteria. They had to be known to be ancient, i.e. written in the 1st century or very early in the 2nd century. The 2nd century books we can tend to identify are Jude and 2nd Peter, maybe 1st John, and they tend to be written about 110, 120. And that's the latest. The rest of them are all written in the 1st century, between Paul's letters about 50, the Gospels in 75 to 85, maybe the Gospel of John about 95 to 100, and a variety of the other things written in that time frame. So they had to be ancient. They had to claim apostolic authorship, which they all did, and they had to be compatible with the emerging Orthodox theology in the 4th century. So what I'm guessing, and this is a guess, let's be very clear, I'm guessing the reason this strange book gets in is because it was known from the 1st century, probably written about 95. So it had been hanging around a long time. There are other apocalyptic books, of the Apocalypse of Peter and stuff, that didn't make it. And the process is intriguing, and it shows how difficult it was even to the people in the 4th century. One of the people who really helped put the New Testament together was the Archbishop of Constantinople, and the personal bishop to Emperor Constantine the First Christian Emperor, a man named Eusebius. And he was told after he chaired the Council of Nicaea, he was told after the council by Constantine, put some Bibles together. And Constantine was a Christian, in my opinion, but a warlord also. When he told you to do something, you did it. Eusebius had a list of books that were floating around. He had a list that was called authoritative, which he was convinced were true texts that should be in the New Testament. They were the 4 Gospels, 13 letters of Paul, Acts, got a cheat sheet here, Hebrews, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation on his authoritative list. He had a list of disputed, maybe yes, maybe no, and he had James, Jude, they're both in. 2 Peter, that's in. 2nd and 3rd John, they're in, but they really don't mean much. Hebrews is on the second list also. It was on the first authoritative and on the disputed. And Revelation's on the disputed list also. Then he has a list of spurious ones. I won't go through them. There's different apocalypse. There's Acts, the different Acts of Paul, letters of Barnabas, Gospel of Peter and Thomas. And it has Revelation on the spurious list also. He didn't know what to do with it himself. So my guess is it gets in. This is a guess. It gets in because of its age. It was known to be ancient, to go back to the 1st century of the church. So and a lot of people haven't known what to do with it. Martin Luther didn't like it. He wanted to move it to the back. It actually is at the back of our New Testament now, probably because of Luther moving, along with some of the other letters he didn't like. He didn't like James. He didn't like Jude, 2 Peter, and Hebrews, and he moved, so he moved Revelation to the back. But he couldn't actually get it pitched out of the New Testament like he tried to do to get James pitched out. Just wouldn't, the church just wouldn't do it. So it's an interesting thing. Like I said, I'm using Barclay's book here, and most Christians find this baffling. I've known one pastor, a good friend, who just loves it and tried to teach us in a class years ago. And we tried, and I couldn't, it just couldn't work with me. It wasn't the book for me. So as much as he tried it. So what it does is it recounts a vision or a series of visions that this gentleman has in this cave on Patmos. Now, visions are a tricky thing to report. What really is a vision? Did he actually have this psychedelic type experience where he saw all these various things? Did he imagine it? You do find reports of visions back in early Christian literature. In 800 and 900, people had visions. But by later time, that claim's pretty much disappeared. Even when you get into things like the Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's book from 1600s, he says it was a dream, not a vision. So we don't really know exactly what happened here. I don't think it was produced by like the natives out in the Southwest harvested mescaline from the peyote and used that to make visions. I don't buy that, whether there was a natural hallucinogen around. I think this is just what he thought. He either saw it, he had a dream, it just came to him. It's just unclear. And it's not something that you find in modern time. The last thing I could hear of that might have been something like a vision was Joseph Smith, who founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Mormons, he was inspired to find these golden tablets. Whether it was a vision or a dream or an inspiration is unclear to me, but nobody since then has really, in the mainstream of Christianity, claimed to be having visions anymore. So it's kind of gone its own way. You do find many of the images that we use to describe heaven, the pearly gates, the streets of gold, and all that, come from Revelation. These come from Revelation. They didn't come from Jesus, remember? Jesus wouldn't tell us what heaven was like. He said, it isn't like that. They didn't pin him down. You couldn't really pin him down. So we don't really know. So, and this is not prophecy. This is apocalyptic vision. Prophecy is when you're saying something like Elijah saying, God's mad at you. You've got these pagan idols in the temple, and he's going to punish you, and this and that and the other. You got to clean this up and all this. Or Prophet Amos said you're abusing your poor people. You're treating them blah 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 blah, and God's going to punish you and send the Assyrians to punish you, which all happened. So that's prophecy. When you're in the here and now, and you're predicting the future based on the current behavior. This is not. This is apocalyptic. This is the end of time. Whenever the end of time is going to come in this huge battle. So it's unusual with that. And, and he starts off with some early visions, and then he goes into 7 letters. We're going to try to cover the 7 letters briefly while we do this, and these letters are condemnation of the 7 churches. These 7 churches were relatively prominent Christian churches in major cities through the area of Western and Central Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. Some of them were down on the coast, Pergamon and Ephesus. Some of them were inland, but there were 7 prominent cities. A lot of these were major cities. They were major trading centers, like we told a couple of weeks ago. We talked about Ephesus. It used to be a major port city, and then the river silted up its bay, and it's died, like Pergamon the same way. So he has the 7 of these letters. And the number 7 is a number of great significance, kind of like a magic or sacred number all through Revelation. And it's maintained some of its specialness even in modern times. It's kind of everybody's favorite number. So when we get into interpreting these messages, there are lots and lots of ways to interpret them. So I'm not going to try to get pinning them down and saying this means this and this means this. I'm just going to try to point out a few of the overalls and draw some modern experiences, observations from them. Clearly, this person came from a Jewish background. He was extremely familiar with the Jewish literature and with the Jewish literature that was written in between the Testaments and not in the Old Testament. So he kept referencing a lot of that. And so he has certain themes, and some of these are fairly common. He refers to Jesus as the Alpha and the Omega. Now, Alpha was the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet. This is the beginning and the end, is what this means. And this is the term we use about Jesus even now, the Alpha and the Omega. Really, he's the A to Z. He's everything. He's from the beginning. He's through the end. This is where it sounds like the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John has Jesus at the beginning, at the creation, and through creation was through him. So it's so that similar. So he's the A to Z, the Alpha and the Omega. It makes a reference to the Lord's Day. Now, this is an unusual reference this early. There's only a couple other references in writings from this time, from the Didache and Ignatius, who refer to the Lord's Day as different than the Sabbath. The Lord's Day becomes officially on Sunday in Constantine's time, which is in 325 or so, a long time later. So this is one of the early references to the Lord's Day as opposed to the Sabbath. It's an interesting thing. Then he has a sword coming from Jesus' mouth. I'm confused about that one. If anybody's got a comment or something, please let me know. By the way, one thing I miss doing it this way are the questions. So if anybody's got a question or a comment, email it to me. We'll try to handle it next week or following week, or maybe we'll collect a bunch of questions and answer them at a separate session. I do miss the questions in the dialogue, so if you have any, send them to me, and we'll try to handle them in a second time. Then they talk about the angels of the 7 churches, and he has these letters condemning to the 7 churches. The first is the condemnation of Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was a major commercial city at the time, and he condemns a church there for eating food sacrificed to idols. Now, this is a tricky one because most of the meat available had been sacrificed to idols, and then the butchers would take it, and whoever they processed it, and that would be the food you could buy, the meat you could buy. And it's interesting because Paul had to struggle with this. The Jewish Christians were really offended by this. They had strict dietary laws in Judaism that you couldn't do this, you couldn't eat that, you couldn't eat this, couldn't eat that, and you couldn't eat with the pagans and this and that. But Paul said, listen, we know these guys are nothing. They don't exist, so don't worry about it. But the author of this book is really upset by that, and some of it may be that you could often be invited to go to the temple. There were huge temples in Ephesus of the pagan gods, and have the meals there with your pagan buddies. And that would be risking corrupting your dedication to the church at the time. So you can argue it that way. But it's a tricky one, and it shows all the ambivalence that you can have about these issues. And he was saying the danger was inside the church. The next it's Smyrna. I've not been to Smyrna. So it was described as a lovely city, but there was a lot of abuse of the Christians there. And so basically the urging there was be firm and stay loyal and persevere and tough this out, and God will take care of it in the end. Then he talks about Pergamon, which is a major city at the time. I've been there to see the ruins. Now, again, it's at the same thing. It's all ruins now as their harbor silt up. And there's an odd reference there about white stones and some blessing that comes with them. And I'm not certain exactly what it is, whether these were tokens of God's blessing, or white was the symbol of purity in the Greek and the Hebrew world. So it may be that you would have these as symbols of your purity or tokens of good luck or something. It's a bit odd, and I can't explain it any more than that. So if anybody wants to read it and send me a better explanation, I'm open to it. Then Thyatira, the threat there, he said, was from the inside, that some people want to relax the standards of what it really means to be a Christian, and to be more appropriate and get along better with their business and commercial ties. And I thought, wow, does this seem like modern life? You know, a lot of churches will do anything, and a lot of people in church, well, they don't want to do anything that don't want to take any stand on any kind of issue that might upset their business ties or their commercial ties. So it shows that human beings haven't changed. Human weaknesses have continued over the 2,000 years. And it also mentions there that some of these people are coming to church just because they're putting on good entertainment. I laughed at that one when I read it. I thought, wow, he's talking about modern church, because there are some churches that have these huge churches, but they put on these fantastic free concerts with professional choirs, professional music. And I'm wondering, are they really getting a message out, or are they just putting on a great show for free? And that you can debate. I don't know the answer to that one. I just know some questions. And so it really sounds like modern life. He talks about Sardis. It's a decaying city. It had been a commercial city, and its commerce is drying up. And the church there is basically inactive, I thought, and ineffective. I thought, well, I've known a lot of inactive and ineffective churches in my day. Again, sounds like he's talking about modern life. Talks about Philadelphia. This is not our Philadelphia, of course. In church there it gets a warning. It's heedless to the discomfort and the abuse of the oppressed, and it needs to pay more attention to that. Laodicea, he says nothing good to say about it. Indifference is the curse of that church. And I thought, well, I've known indifferent churches before, and there's indifferent churches around right now. I'm not identifying any of them, but so if you look at some of these things, they really are timeless criticisms of churches, and I'm certainly guilty of any of these criticisms myself. You know, I'm not as good as I should be. I try, but I'm not. And get into chapter 4, you get an open door to heaven, where he sees God on the throne. It's interesting, but he doesn't describe God on a heavenly throne as in a human description. Doesn't describe him in any kind of physical description at all, which is an interesting thing, because most people who describe God or picture him as a human manifestation, which was true of all the deity presentations we've seen. Even the devils they have horns and tails, but they have human faces and stuff. Then he sees 4 living creatures, a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a human emerge, and most scholars identify these with the 4 gospel writers. But if you look at the history of them, they scramble them up. Someone will say it's this order, someone will say the lion isn't so-and-so, it's actually the ox, and this and that and other. Again, even the ancients who studied this, they couldn't figure all these things out by themselves. And then you go on in chapter 5, the middle of it, the emergence of the Lamb. The Lamb comes out, and the Lamb clearly represents Jesus, because it has marks on it which show it had been slain, and it has signs of the damage, all that, and a lot of symbolism to make it very clear that this is Jesus, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise of the redemption of not only the Israelites, but of everyone. And then they have a series of creatures from below, and they're all praising Jesus and promising redemption. I'm going to stop there. Okay, that's enough. I'll try to finish it up next time, and so we can only torture ourselves with this difficult book for 2 sessions. But like I said, you got any questions, comments, criticisms, just email them back to me, and I'll take a time to share them with the group. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you.